He had one rule that made no sense to any man riding beside him. The frontier demanded blood without question. He drew a line most outlaws wouldn't recognize. Subscribe for more Western stories. Comment where you're watching from. His name was Ezra Kane, and by the spring of 1878, he had robbed stagecoaches across 3 territories, burned supply wagons meant for cavalry posts, and left more than a dozen men dead in saloons and dry creek beds. Lawmen knew his face from hand-drawn circulars nailed to posts in Denver and Santa Fe. Bounty hunters carried his description folded in their coat pockets. He moved through the high desert like a ghost, appearing only when he needed supplies, or when a job paid enough to risk exposure. Ezra rode alone most of the time. Other outlaws offered partnership, but few lasted more than a month before they realized his methods didn't match theirs. He planned his work carefully, studied the routes, knew which towns had sheriffs worth fearing and which had men too drunk or too afraid to follow. He avoided unnecessary killing when he could, not out of mercy, but because bodies drew attention and attention brought posses. But there was one thing Ezra would not do under any circumstance, and it set him apart from nearly every man living outside the law in those years. He would not raise a hand against a native family. He would not raid their camps, steal their horses, or take part in any violence that touched their women or children. It wasn't a rule born from sentiment or some misguided notion of nobility. It came from something he had seen years before, something that changed the way he understood cruelty. In the winter of 1872, Ezra had been riding with a gang led by a man named Harlan Cross. Cross ran a crew that moved through Colorado and Wyoming, hitting freight lines and isolated homesteads. They were brutal and efficient, and Ezra was young enough then to believe that survival meant doing whatever the job required. One cold afternoon, Cross led them to a small encampment near the Wind River. The people there were Shoshone, a handful of families trying to make it through the season on what little they had. Cross wanted their horses and anything else worth taking. Ezra watched as the men went through the camp. He saw an old man struck down for refusing to move fast enough. He saw a woman clutching a child while one of Cross's men tore through her belongings. He saw fear in faces that had already known too much of it, and he saw that none of it was necessary. The horses could have been taken without the violence. The supplies could have been claimed without the terror. But Cross wanted the people to feel it, wanted them to remember, wanted to carve his presence into their lives like a scar. Ezra didn't stop it. He stood there holding the reins of his horse and did nothing. When they rode away, he carried that silence with him. It sat in his chest like a stone, and over the months that followed, it grew heavier. He left Cross's gang before the year ended and made a promise to himself that he would never be part of something like that again. If he was going to live as an outlaw, if he was going to take what didn't belong to him and hurt men who stood in his way, he would at least draw one line he wouldn't cross. It was a strange code for a man in his position. The frontier didn't reward restraint. Settlers saw native people as obstacles or threats. The army saw them as problems to be solved. Other outlaws saw them as easy targets when money ran low or when they wanted to stir up trouble that would distract lawmen. Ezra's refusal to participate made him an oddity, and in a world where trust was already scarce, oddities didn't last long. By 1878, tensions between settlers and the tribes in the Utah and Colorado territories had reached a breaking point. The government had pushed most of the Ute bands onto smaller and smaller parcels of land, promising supplies that rarely came and enforcing rules that made survival almost impossible. Desperation led to conflict. Livestock went missing. Homesteads were raided. Settlers demanded protection, and the army responded with patrols that often ended in bloodshed. Ezra kept his distance from all of it. He stayed in the high country, moving between small mining camps and forgotten trails where the law didn't reach. He took work when he could find it, robbing payroll shipments or helping other outlaws move stolen goods across state lines. But when jobs involved hitting native settlements or participating in raids that targeted families, he turned them down. Word spread. Men started to notice. One evening in late April, Ezra stopped in a camp outside of Durango, where a group of outlaws had gathered to plan their next move. He recognized a few faces, men he had worked with before, and he sat near the fire while they talked. The conversation turned to a Ute camp located about 2 days' ride to the north. The camp was small, maybe 15 people, and it sat near a trail that freight wagons used to move silver ore down from the mines. One of the men, a lean, hard-eyed drifter named Poke, suggested hitting the camp and taking their horses. He said it would send a message and make the trail safer for their own work. Ezra listened without saying anything at first. The other men seemed interested. They talked about how easy it would be, how the camp had no warriors worth worrying about, how the horses were good stock and would sell well in New Mexico. Poke kept pushing the idea, his voice growing more insistent. Finally, he looked across the fire at Ezra and asked if he was in. Ezra shook his head. He said he didn't take work like that. Poke's expression shifted, something between confusion and irritation. He asked why. Ezra didn't explain. He simply repeated that he wasn't interested and that he would find other work. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. One of the other men muttered something under his breath. Poke stared at Ezra for a long moment, then turned back to the others and continued planning as if Ezra wasn't there. Ezra left the camp before sunrise. He knew what that moment had cost him. Poke wasn't the type to forget a refusal, and neither were the men who rode with him. In their world, a man who wouldn't participate was a man who couldn't be trusted. Worse, he was a man who might talk, who might have principles that didn't align with survival. Ezra understood that by drawing his line, he had marked himself. Over the next few weeks, Ezra heard rumors. The raid on the Ute camp had happened, and it had gone badly. The outlaws had taken the horses, but the camp had not been as defenseless as Poke believed. 2 of the raiders were killed, and the survivors barely made it out. The army caught wind of it and sent patrols into the area, which made every outlaw in the territory a target. Freight lines shut down for a time, and the work dried up. Men were angry, and they needed someone to blame. Poke spread the story that Ezra had known about the raid and had refused to help, suggesting that his refusal had something to do with the failure. It wasn't true, but truth mattered less than the story. Other outlaws started to see Ezra as a liability, a man whose sympathies lay in the wrong direction. Bounty hunters heard the rumors and began to wonder if Ezra might be willing to talk to the law in exchange for leniency. Suspicion grew on all sides. Ezra tried to stay ahead of it. He moved further into the mountains, taking work that kept him isolated. He robbed a mail coach near the border and sold the contents to a fence in Aztec. He helped a smuggler move rifles across the Colorado line and took his pay in gold. But everywhere he went, he felt the pressure closing in. Men who had once been willing to work with him now avoided him. Contacts who used to offer jobs stopped sending word. He was being cut off, piece by piece, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the isolation turned into something worse. In early June, Ezra crossed paths with a man named Garrett Lyle. Lyle was a bounty hunter, known for his persistence and his willingness to track men into places most hunters wouldn't go. He had been following Ezra for weeks, moving quietly, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. They met on a narrow trail near the San Juan River, and Lyle made it clear he wasn't there to take Ezra in. He wanted information. Lyle said he had heard the stories about Ezra's refusal to raid native camps, and he wanted to know if they were true. Ezra didn't answer directly, but his silence was enough. Lyle nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he told Ezra that the law didn't care about his principles. They cared about the robberies, the dead men, the stolen gold. But Lyle said there were others who did care, people who saw Ezra's refusal as a sign of weakness or worse, as evidence that he was working with the tribes in some way. It was an absurd accusation, but Ezra understood how it could spread. In a time when fear and suspicion ruled the frontier, any deviation from expected behavior could be twisted into betrayal. Lyle suggested that Ezra's best chance was to prove his loyalty by participating in the kind of work he had been avoiding. He said there would be more raids, more opportunities, and that if Ezra wanted to survive, he needed to show he was willing to do what had to be done. Ezra told Lyle he wasn't interested. Lyle shrugged and said that was Ezra's choice, but the world wouldn't wait for him to change his mind. They parted ways, and Ezra continued north, knowing that the encounter was a warning. The pressure wasn't just coming from outlaws anymore. It was coming from everyone. The truth of Ezra's past came to the surface in late June, though he had carried it silently for years. Near the Wind River, in the same region where he had once stood by and watched Harlan Cross's gang terrorize a Shoshone camp, there lived a family who had survived that winter. Among them was a woman named Naomi and her son, a boy who had been only 6 years old when the raid happened. Ezra didn't know their names then, and he had never returned to the area, but the memory of that day had never left him. What Ezra didn't know was that Naomi remembered him, not because he had participated in the violence, but because he had been the only man who hadn't. She had seen him standing apart, holding his horse, watching but not acting. In the years since, she had come to understand that his inaction wasn't the same as participation, but it wasn't innocence either. When she spoke of that day to her son, she described the men who had come and the one who had stood still. The boy grew up hearing that story, and he grew up with a question his mother couldn't answer. Why had that man done nothing? In the summer of 1878, Naomi's family was living near a small trading post outside of Fort Duchesne. They had managed to survive through careful trade and by staying out of the conflicts that erupted around them. But the post was located near a route that outlaws used to move stolen goods, and it was only a matter of time before violence reached them again. Ezra arrived at the trading post in early July, looking for supplies and a place to rest. He didn't recognize Naomi when he first saw her, and she didn't approach him. But her son, now a young man of 12, watched Ezra carefully. The boy had heard his mother's description enough times to know the face. He saw the way Ezra moved, the caution in his posture, the eyes that scanned every corner of the post. And he saw something else, something his mother had mentioned, but that he hadn't understood until now. The man carried guilt. Naomi finally approached Ezra while he was preparing to leave. She didn't accuse him or demand an explanation. She simply asked if he remembered the winter of 1872. Ezra's hand froze on the saddle strap. He turned slowly and looked at her, and the recognition was immediate. He saw the same woman who had clutched her child while Harlan Cross's men tore through the camp. He saw the fear that had been in her eyes then, and he saw that it had been replaced by something harder, something that had been forged in the years since. Ezra didn't deny it. He told her he remembered. She asked why he had done nothing, and he said he didn't have an answer that would matter. She told him that silence could be a choice just as much as action, and that both carried weight. Then she said something that cut deeper than any accusation. She told him that her family had survived that day, but others hadn't. She told him that the violence hadn't stopped, that men like the ones he had ridden with were still out there, still taking and destroying. And she told him that the line he had drawn for himself now, the rule he claimed to live by, didn't erase what he had failed to do before. Ezra had no response. He stood there in the dust outside the trading post, holding the reins of his horse, and for the second time in his life, he felt the weight of his own inaction. Naomi turned and walked back toward her home, and her son followed. Ezra left the post and rode into the hills, but the conversation stayed with him. It clarified something he had been trying to avoid. His rule wasn't just about refusing to harm native families. It was about trying to balance a debt he could never repay. 3 days later, Ezra learned that a group of outlaws was planning another raid. This time, the target was the area near Fort Duchesne, and the trading post where Naomi's family lived was directly in their path. The group was led by Polk, the same man who had been frustrated by Ezra's refusal months earlier. Polk had gathered a crew of men who were desperate and angry. and they had decided that hitting settlements near the fort would draw the army's attention away from other operations. It was a reckless plan, driven more by spite than strategy, and Ezra knew it would end in bloodshed. Word reached Ezra through a contact who owed him a favor. The man said that Polk had mentioned Ezra by name, suggesting that if Ezra showed up and participated, it might clear the suspicion that had been building around him. It was an invitation and a test. If Ezra joined the raid, he would prove his loyalty and regain the trust of men whose trust was worth almost nothing. If he refused, he would confirm what they already suspected, and he would become a target himself. Ezra didn't need time to think about it. He knew what the raid would mean for Naomi and her family, and he knew what his participation would make him. The line he had drawn wasn't negotiable, but refusing to participate wasn't enough anymore. If he stayed silent, if he simply walked away and let the raid happen, he would be repeating the same failure he had committed 6 years earlier. This time, doing nothing wasn't an option. Ezra rode to Fort Duchesne and found the officer in charge, a lieutenant named Howell. He told Howell about the raid, gave him the location and the timing, and described the men involved. Howell was skeptical at first. Outlaws didn't turn on each other, and information like this usually came with a price. But Ezra didn't ask for anything. He simply provided the details and left. Howell took the information seriously enough to prepare a patrol, and when Polk's crew approached the area 2 nights later, they found soldiers waiting for them. The confrontation was brief and brutal. 2 of Polk's men were killed, and the rest scattered into the desert. Polk himself was captured, and when he was questioned, he made it clear who he believed had betrayed them. Ezra's name spread quickly through the outlaw networks that operated in the territory. By the time the sun rose the next morning, every man who lived outside the law knew that Ezra Kane had talked to the army. Ezra understood what he had done. In the world he had chosen to live in, betrayal was the worst crime. It didn't matter that the raid would have ended in innocent deaths. It didn't matter that Polk's plan had been reckless and doomed from the start. What mattered was that Ezra had crossed a line that outlaws held sacred, and there would be consequences. He didn't try to run. Running would only delay the inevitable. Instead, he stayed in the high country, moving between camps and keeping watch. He knew they would come for him, and he knew he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The only question was how long he had before they found him. It took less than a week. A group of 5 men tracked him to a canyon near the Dolores River. Ezra saw them coming and positioned himself on high ground, hoping the terrain would give him an advantage. But the men spread out and approached from multiple directions, and it became clear that they weren't interested in a fair fight. They wanted him dead, and they were willing to be patient. The standoff lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Ezra fired when he had clear shots, and he managed to wound one of the men badly enough to take him out of the fight. But ammunition was limited, and the men below knew it. They waited, calling out threats and accusations, reminding him of what he had done and what it had cost them. As the light faded, Ezra realized he had 2 choices. He could stay where he was and hope for a miracle, or he could try to slip away under cover of darkness and risk being caught in the open. He chose to stay. When the night was full dark, the men below built a fire and settled in to wait. Ezra sat with his back against a rock, his rifle across his knees, and thought about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Harlan Cross and the Shoshone camp. He thought about Naomi and her son. He thought about the line he had drawn and the price it had demanded. And he thought about the fact that, for the first time in years, he had acted instead of standing still. The men came for him just before dawn. They climbed the slope quietly, moving through the rocks with practiced care. Ezra heard them and fired twice, but the shots went wide in the dim light. They rushed him from 3 sides, and the fight ended quickly. He took a bullet in the shoulder and another in the leg, and when he fell, they were on him. They didn't kill him right away. They dragged him down to the canyon floor and made sure he understood why he was going to die. Polk had sent word from his cell that Ezra's betrayal had cost more than just a failed raid. It had brought the army's attention to routes and contacts that other outlaws depended on. Jobs had been lost. Men had been arrested. The fragile network that allowed them to operate had been damaged, and Ezra was the reason. One of the men, a scarred gunman named Hatch, told Ezra that his rule, his line, his refusal to do what needed to be done, had marked him as weak. And weakness, Hatch said, had no place on the frontier. They shot him twice more and left him in the canyon. They didn't bother to check if he was dead. They took his horse, his guns, and anything else of value, and they rode away as the sun rose over the desert. Ezra didn't die in that canyon, though he came close. A Ute hunter found him 2 days later, barely alive, and brought him to a camp where a medicine woman worked to keep him breathing. He spent weeks recovering, drifting in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infections and blood loss. When he finally woke fully, he learned that the people who had saved him knew who he was. They had heard the stories about the outlaw who refused to harm native families, and they had heard about the raid he had stopped. They didn't trust him, but they didn't turn him away either. Ezra stayed with them through the late summer and into the fall. He healed slowly, and as his strength returned, he began to understand that the life he had known was over. He couldn't go back to the outlaw camps or the trails he had once traveled. The bounty on his head had grown, and the men who wanted him dead would keep looking. But more than that, he had crossed a threshold. He had acted on his principles, and the cost had been everything. When he was strong enough to travel, he left the camp. The people there gave him supplies and directions to a settlement in northern New Mexico where he might be able to disappear. They didn't ask for anything in return, and he didn't offer explanations. He simply thanked them and rode south. Ezra reached the settlement in late October. It was a small place, barely more than a collection of adobe buildings and a church, and it sat far enough from the main trails that the law rarely visited. He found work doing repairs and manual labor, using a different name and keeping his head down. No one asked questions, and he didn't volunteer answers. He lived quietly, and the months passed without incident. But the story of what he had done didn't disappear. It moved through the outlaw networks and the army posts, changing shape as it traveled. Some versions painted him as a traitor who had sold out his own kind. Others described him as a man who had drawn a line and paid for it. A few, told in quieter voices around fires in native camps, spoke of him as someone who had tried, however imperfectly, to do something right. The law never found him. The bounty hunters who looked gave up after a few months, deciding that a man who had been shot and left for dead wasn't worth the effort. Polk served 2 years in prison and was released, but by then, the frontier had changed. The conflicts that had defined the late 1870s were fading, replaced by railroads and settlements and a different kind of order. Men like Polk found fewer places to operate, and the old outlaw networks collapsed under the weight of their own violence. Ezra lived in that small New Mexico settlement for the rest of his life. He never returned to the life he had known, and he never spoke about the things he had done. He worked, kept to himself, and watched as the world around him transformed. When he died in 1891, there were only a handful of people at his funeral, and none of them knew the full story of who he had been. But in certain places, among certain people, his name lingered. The Ute families who had heard about the raid he stopped remembered. The people who had saved him in the canyon told their children about the outlaw who had drawn a line. And in the settlements where stories of the Old West were told and retold, there were occasional mentions of a man who had refused to do what the frontier demanded and who had survived, barely, because of it.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.